Hello, everyone, and welcome to Violence Isn't Just Physical webinar. My name is Laura Brookhouse, Farm Safety Advisor with Farm Safety Nova Scotia. I'll be presenting today's webinar. I'm an alumnus with the Nova Scotia Agricultural College, and my career has evolved over the years significantly into health and safety. I'm a Canadian registered safety professional and a certified health and safety consultant. I have 12 years of experience in the occupational health and safety industry, and I work with many employers across the country in different industries. I'm presenting the topic today to help farmers understand their requirements for having a prevention plan in place to protect workers against violence in the workplace. The recorded version of this webinar will be available after the webinar on our YouTube channel. Just visit Farm Safety YouTube channel. I am not able to see questions during the chat. I'm not able to see questions in the chat during the webinar while I'm sharing my screen. Please feel free to unmute yourself to ask those questions or provide any feedback to let me know what you're seeing in the screen and anything else that you want to address. Otherwise, I'll answer those questions listed in the chat at the end of the webinar. There's a little bit of a disclaimer. The webinar is to give a brief overview of the violence in the workplace regulations in Nova Scotia. This information does not replace the full details of that regulation, which all of the attendees and viewers of this webinar should be familiar. For those of you just joining the webinar, my name is Laura Brookhouse, and I'll be presenting this webinar on Violence Isn't Just Physical. Let's get started. So our learning and performance outcomes today are: first, define workplace violence and harassment. As you guys know, that's the first place always when we look at regulation where we should start. Learn how to conduct a risk assessment for violence and review the tool used, and then identify what to include in a workplace violence and harassment prevention plan. We are also going to build a workplace violence policy statement and code of practice, identify the training requirements for farmers and workers on the workplace violence program, and learn how to handle workplace violence incidents to include documentation requirements and offering help to affected workers. So first, as mentioned at the very beginning, let's look at that workplace violence regulation. So we focus on the definition of violence. So under occupational health and safety, threats, including a threatening statement or threatening behavior that gives an employee reasonable cause to believe that an employee is at risk of physical injury. So that's the verbal. And then conduct or attempted conduct of a person that endangers the physical health or physical safety of an employee. So what I want to do is take a look at that regulation in particular. And please just give me a shout out. Just unmute yourself if you can't see my screen. You should be able to see violence in the workplace regulations. It is kind of small, but this is how it's brought up right into the website. So as I read the definition, you can see here's our definition of violence and the meaning that I just read out. Now, the key is with that definition, does this regulation apply to your firm? So Section 3, these regulations do not diminish the responsibility of all workplace parties to recognize violence as an occupational health and safety hazard in carrying out their precautions and duties under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So right there, it's a general disclaimer and disclosure that if this can happen on your farm, then it should be addressed. Most have a tendency to look at Section 4, look for themselves in this list, and you can see dental services, veterinary services, testing and diagnostic services, pharmaceutical, you'll see retail right here under this, delivery services, but you're not seeing agricultural farm specifically. So this is where right away a lot of farmers will go, oh, this doesn't apply to me, and then move on. But we need to read, and as I always mention in my posts, always read the regulation in full, not just certain sections, because the full regulation will actually give you the true story of the requirement, whereas only parts may only give you bits and pieces, which without tying it all together, we may not understand our full requirement. So what we do, even if we're not in the list, and we're not sure, what we do is a violence risk assessment. So we're going to go through what that entails and how easily that can be done on your particular firm. And then from that risk assessment, if there's any potential for violence or past violence, then this is when a program would need to be implemented, unless it was given to you by an OHS officer saying that they visited the farm and they say you require one, so that it's been designated by an OHS officer. So it also goes through in the regulation when new violence risk assessment is required. So how often should we be assessing the farm? The workplace violence prevention plan, and not to panic, I'm going to go through all of these particular sections in a few details in coming slides. Review and revision of your workplace violence prevention plan, workplace violence prevention statement, and I can show you where that can go in particular. Information that must be provided to the employees, and posting is a great way to provide it and handing it over physically, especially during the safety orientation or at the beginning of the season. Training and supervision for employees, especially if they're at risk. Duty to report incidents, and then how to document those incidents. Anyone who may be exposed, as well as employers with multiple temporary workplaces. So, for instance, if you have a vegetable farm and you have several stands set up throughout the province, those would be temporary workplaces. It would be a few months throughout the year, with it usually in the summer months. And the ability to meet your duties collectively, and I'll explain that a little bit more as well. So let's take a look at our next slide, which involves human rights definitions. So here we learn not only is violence in the workplace kind of covered under occupational health and safety legislation in its own regulation, but it's also part of human rights. So under human rights in the definitions, harass means to engage in a course of vexatious or unwelcoming behavior, which you can see in here, or a comment that is unknown or ought reasonably to be unknown to be unwelcome. So unwanted mean something that would offend a person in particular. So before I click on to the human rights definitions, I've got one more definition for you, and that is sexual harassment. So again, there's your vexatious term, which just honestly read that as harassment. So it's conduct or a course of comment that is known or ought reasonably to be known as unwelcome, sorry. And then here, second. Now, basically what this means is, without having to read that entire paragraph to you, is if this sexual advancement is unwanted and the person has let you know that it is unwanted, but they continue to do that, then that is also considered sexual harassment. And one more, if at any point there could be reprisal to that person or a consequence, then as part of this sexual advance, and if they reject it, they could get into trouble, then this is also considered sexual harassment. Typically, if you see here, especially if this is done by a person who has authority or where it could benefit that particular person. I'm just going to click on human rights, and what this will do is bring up the Act. And so this is the full Act in PDF form. And of course, it gives you all of the sections of, and it's kind of small, and I'll make it a little bit bigger for you. Discrimination, the Human Rights Commission, administration, so all the particulars. But again, here is the purpose, and then we'll scroll a little bit further, and here where it starts is your definitions. So here we can understand who in particular this applies to, as well as the meaning of harassment. I'm not going to go through this in its entirety. As you can see, it's rather lengthy, but know that you can go back to, and I reference this at the end, the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act, scrolling up to the top. And this is where you can also gain information on workplace violence. So moving forward, your violence risk assessment. Now, a lot of people, how do we do this? And there is one simple way to be able to determine if there's a risk of violence on your farm. This assessment should be done in writing and gives a detail of the events and the nature of any type of risk. And the way this can be easily done is through supervisor and worker violence surveys. So I'm just going to flip one slide before we kind of go to those surveys. I'm going to show you some examples that are available to you on the Farm Safety website. And so included in this survey, you can conduct it annually. It may be required more often depending on the number of incidents that are happening on farm. Conduct a survey where there is a complaint. So anytime a worker brings a complaint towards the employer or a third party, then a survey must be completed to see who that affects. And those surveys are anonymous. They're not a public document. They do need to be provided to the Health and Safety Committee and Health and Safety reps so they can help you develop corrective action. So what we're going to do is review those surveys. So what I'm going to do up here is click the link, which takes us right to the Farm Safety Nova Scotia website. My computer's been running a little bit slow this morning, so my apologies. So where we're at on the website is under Resources and a Guide to Your Farm Safety Plan. And in section 2 of the workbook, which when you bring up the Guide to the Farm Safety Plan, this menu exists on the right. Here under Workbook, when you click this, it brings up this menu on the left. So here at the bottom, these are supplements to the Farm Safety Plan, all based on workplace violence and harassment. And so we have the policy statement, which we're going to look at shortly, the code of practice, the supervisor survey, the worker survey, as well as an employee assistance program. So first, let's take a look at the supervisor survey. It'll just take a second here to load. Please let me know if you're not able to see my screen. You'll have to unmute yourself if you can't see this screen. So here is the supervisor's workplace violence survey. So this is a simple way of asking the questions to see what may exist or have existed in the past in regards to workplace violence. So we've broken it up into a few sections, the first being the work area, so describing exactly what they do. Then it goes through history, activities that may expose the workers to a risk of violence or harassment. And so they would just tick off the box of saying yes or no, writing in any comments that they think is relevant. And then scrolling down, factors that increase the risk of violence. And these are things like when they may not be able to see other workers or working alone perhaps in isolation away from the farm and in a field somewhere. Or this could be at the fruit stand as referenced earlier. Maybe on the side of the road, a distance down the road from your farm. So then again, reducing the risk. So having the supervisor describe what measures are already in place to prevent violence. So what is currently working. And then of course, any further steps they recommend, and then any assistance that may help accomplish getting in further prevention plans. So the supervisor survey is very detailed, as it should, because those are the people who are overseeing the work. So now I'm going to bring you to the worker survey. And again, if you don't see these, please let me know. I'll make it a little bit bigger. The worker survey is a lot shorter. It's one page, very simple yes and no, with the ability to comment down below. And it's broken up a little bit differently. So safety at work survey, so asking if they feel safe at work, very simple, generic questions. Have they ever been subject to workplace violence before? And then asking if there's any improvement needed. So is there any security protocols currently in place? What about parking lots? Where do they put their belongings, blind spots, anything like that? Any type of emergency communication? How do they call out for help? Layouts of office or the farm in particular, where the fruit stands are, any of those particulars that may open somebody up for somebody to hide or be able to respond to somebody without being seen. So then, of course, have they been educated on the program? So are they aware of this, the policy that we're going to review, the code of practice? Have they been trained on it? Do they know who to report incidents to, ask questions, and whatnot? So this also gives them a little bit of space to add in some comments at the bottom. So these forms that are available on the Farm Safety Nova Scotia website are available for download. So they open up in Word, and all you need to do if you want is download it and use it as your own. So just add your farm name on it, change some of the questions if you prefer, and run with it. So now going back, moving forward, let's look at that prevention plan. It's really not as difficult as it sounds. We call it a plan, we say documentation, but these can be quite easily done, especially with the templates currently available. And when you follow the violence in the workplace regulation, it gives you all these details as well, and you can just transfer them quickly into a policy or a particular prevention plan. Your prevention plan could also be a part of your code of practice, which we're going to look at in the next few slides. So your prevention statement, you're going to have to say the purpose of it. Then, of course, include in your prevention plan the measures to eliminate or minimize your risk for workplace violence and harassment. And then, of course, mention the code of practice. So how does this all unfold? And we're going to look at that in its details shortly, as well as the training requirements. What do they need to be trained on and how? So that will be coming up in a bit as well. Incident investigation procedures. I'm going to go through a few details there. And most importantly, review with your health and safety committee or rep. They're a great resource. They're boots on the ground, tell you what's happening within the farm, in any of the remote locations that people may be working, that can give you the details on what may be happening that has not yet been addressed. Collaboration and consultation are fantastic for building these types of programs. So this prevention plan should be made available not just to your workers on the farm, but any contractors, suppliers, visitors, anybody who's self-employed that comes to the farm to do any type of work. So, and of course, you want to post it in an obvious and easily accessible location. And even at your fruit stands in remote locations, if there's a place to post this information, having it available so that the public can even see that there's a duty to respect the worker at that particular workplace when they're dealing with each other. And it's a really good idea to review the plan at least every 5 years, or when the assessment indicates a significant change. So what that means is, has there been a change to occupational health and safety legislation? The federal occupational health and safety legislation has just changed and updated their workplace violence and harassment legislation. So that doesn't really apply to us, but looking at it is kind of beneficial to see what may be coming in our province in years to come, because typically what happens with the Canada Labour Code under the federal regulations is slowly merges into the other provinces and becomes best practice. So as promised, let's look at building your policy guide. So first, you got to have a commitment to eliminate and minimize the risk. There's a reason why you're doing this. So you got to recognize violence as an OHS hazard. So this is something that is happening in the workplace. Recognize that it's physical and emotional harm resulting from violence. Hence the title, violence isn't just physical. There's also that emotional component. Recognize that workplace violence is unacceptable. Even having signs posted in the workplace detailing a respectful workplace environment, or actually posting it is unacceptable, is key, and key reminders. Should be some sort of disciplinary action included in your policy statement, a legislation reference, as well as reference to the code of practice if it's separate of your policy statement. So again, I'm going to click this link. It's going to take us to the Farm Safety Nova Scotia website. taking us to the Farm Safety Plan resources in Workbook Section 2. Like I said, if you go to the right-hand column, it will just click Workbook. It brings up this menu on the left-hand side under Section 2. So we're going to look at the policy statement. Just waiting for it to download here. Bring it up. Make it a little bit bigger for you. So at the very beginning, it gives you the policy, the purpose behind developing this particular policy. So to protect employees from workplace violence and harassment, very simple. It's a one-page policy, but it lays it all out there. Then it tells us what types of violence and harassment we want to prevent in the body right here and who it applies to. So it is the expectation that everyone behaves in a professional, respectful manner and work together to prevent workplace violence and harassment. Very key message. And then here, it details it may not just happen only on farm, but this can also happen when traveling to fields, to conferences, client locations, other farms, any social situations that may happen on or off work time, as well as where a lot of the farms are your home. So it could be transferring not just on the farm property where all the farm buildings are, but to your home as well. It could be at your house. And then, of course, referring to the code of practice, what measures are included in that code of practice. And we're going to open that up in a second, so you're going to see the details of it. And as listed, the disciplinary action. So what is going to happen to the person who violates this policy? Okay. And then there's the full reference to the code of practice again. And then a reference to legislation down here. Not only does it reference to federal and provincial legislation, but this also references back to your human rights. So everything is embodied in that one policy statement. And again, you can download this and make this your own. Just add in your farm name and make any adjustments that you think is applicable for your particular organization. So moving back, oopsie. Let's look at the code of practice. So in the code of practice, this one's a little bit longer. It's a couple pages long, but we want to include the scope. So what is included as a workplace violence and harassment code of practice? We have to review those definitions so people understand what it means to be in violation of the workplace violence regulations and your expectations on the farm. You may go over and above what those regulations are stating. How to report incidents. So you want some details on what the workers are going to do, maybe even the public, your suppliers, any of your contractors, how they're going to report incidents. And note that anything that is reported is confidential, and I'm going to look at that a little bit more closely. Resources available, so where people can get help if they've been a victim of the violence or harassment. Evaluation of the program, and we talked about a little bit that we should at least review every 5 years. And then again, another legislation reference that should always be posted and reposted, so people know that there is support for this particular program. So let's look at a copy of the code of practice, and it's taking us back to the website. Here at the Farm Safety Nova Scotia website, looking under resources, a guide to a farm safety plan. Well, actually, I'll just click this in its entirety so you can see the pages change. So this is where it brings up the guide in general. By just scrolling over under section 2, click workbook. And then over to the left, here under supplements, here is your workplace violence and harassment and code of practice. Just waiting for it to download. There we go. And make it a little bit bigger. Here's your code of practice. So now at the very beginning, we said scope. So here is our scope. Complete workplace violence and harassment is defined as the actual threatened attempt or intended or likely to cause injury to harass, threaten, intimidate, bully, or otherwise harm another person physically or psychologically. And then there's given examples. So these examples are part of your scope. So early clues to behavior that may indicate aggression or difficulty to maintain control include an increase in agitation and behavior such as pacing, clenching, or pounding fists, increased verbal hostility under the influence of prescribed or illegal substances, have a mental health disorder, frustrated or angry. So there's your scope. So this is how it all starts. And we've included our definitions as part of that scope. Then, of course, reporting the investigation or reporting the incident, and then noting here that it's confidential. So these are not documents that get shared with the entire company. They only get shared with those who need to be immediately involved in the investigation. And as part of that, it should be your health and safety committee or committee members, or the health and safety representative, depending on how many people you have on the farm. Then it goes through how the investigation will be dealt with. Reporting, making sure everything is documented. Your resources. So anyone affected by workplace violence and harassment will receive medical care as soon as possible at the time of the reporting of the incident. They will receive ongoing care and support, both physically and psychologically, through suitable medical treatment, such as through the Employee Assistance Program. Now you're looking at that going, well, we don't have one of those. The good news is I have a sample one, which I'm going to bring up in a little bit. And what I've done is looked at various areas around Nova Scotia that provide assistance in this, based on this particular topic. So we'll dive a little bit more deeper where those are and how to access. Again, available on the website. And then as part of this code of practice, we implemented roles and responsibilities of those who may be involved. So the farm name would be incorporated here, but it could also be stakeholders of the farm or managers or supervisors who support the program in its entirety and who are the people the incidents are reported to. So they would be also the same people that would provide the support and resources in a timely manner, train, as well as oversee any measures that have been implemented, and basically participate fully in the program and making sure everybody is falling within the program. So they monitor and encourage the workers to raise concerns about any workplace violence or harassment that may occur on or off farm. And here we mentioned the evaluation. We said every 5 years, but you can change this to however often you need, but also noting that you may reevaluate if there is an actual incident. And as mentioned, always reference to applicable legislation, which we've done here, Violence in the Workplace Regulations, as well as the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act. Close out here. So here's the training requirements. So we always want to train them on the rights and responsibilities. So we train them on the rights and responsibilities within our own policy statement, as well as within our code of practice, under human rights, and occupational health and safety. So it may be a benefit to be sure all of those roles and responsibilities are reflected in both the policy and code of practice, so it's all in one place, and then make reference to legislation. Include your prevention statement, your measures to eliminate or minimize risk. So what do they put in place? And this could be as part of your hazard assessment. How to recognize potential for violence and how to respond. So what do they look for once they're working and everything's in place? How do they know how to identify any potential situations that could occur? How do they prevent them from happening? And then, of course, how to respond to an incident, and then reporting that incident, making sure it's documented and the incident is investigated. The documentation, I haven't said this enough. So anything that deals with workplace violence regulations and any part of this type of incident should be very well documented. It's highly sensitive, so everything should be clearly outlined so that one, the investigation can determine the cause of the particular incident, as well as you can implement a corrective action that will be particular to that situation. If we keep things generalized or we don't write things down, we have a tendency to forget certain details. But once everything is documented, we get all of the details. And then, so we get a more targeted corrective action plan, which can be implemented and then, of course, prevent further incident from happening of similar nature. And then, of course, we want to give notice to the employees that were involved. So not all the employees, again, this is confidential, but to those who were involved in the incident and in part of the investigation process, as well as to the Health and Safety Committee who were hopefully involved in your investigation, or the Health and Safety rep, whichever you have on file. So here's that providing assistance. So under your code of practice, that's that resources piece. So you always want to debrief with the affected employee, let them know what's happening as the investigation goes on. You wanted to make sure this investigation happens very quickly and doesn't get prolonged for long periods of time. Then you want to bring in some professional medical treatment and counseling, perhaps, let them know what's available to them. And then if possible, depending on the size of your firm and how things can be reported on firm, you may want to consider a third party. What if this particular person who is the offender is the person that is supposed to be reported to? So for instance, worker A reports to manager B. Worker A is the one having problem with manager B, but the policy outlines manager B deals with these incidents. So there should be a place for worker A to go to be able to report this so that it still can be dealt with. And then, of course, review your employee assistance program. Now you can adopt this one. I'm going back to the website, same location you were just at. Scroll, we're still in section 2 of the workbook. The very bottom, employee assistance program. And there it's downloaded. And here it is. So as mentioned, this isn't specific to any one particular county within the province. I've included several counties. These are not tried, tested, and true locations. I'm not sure of the reputation, so these are ones that are most common, commonly used across the province. So it would be up to the person seeking assistance to choose which one they would like to go to. So we have, of course, Dartmouth, Truro, New Glasgow, Antigonish, and then Avalon area, Colchester, again, another one here, close in the Truro area, Bridgewater, another one in Dartmouth and Halifax. Many resources in Dartmouth and Halifax, not as many in our outer lying rural areas, but available, worth a try. So here there are their addresses and phone numbers. Again, feel free to download this, add your farm name. If you know of one that's closer to you, add that one to the list. Always include any source of reference to that particular location, such as the phone number, email address, website address, or physical building address. Just gonna back out of here. And as mentioned, here's your references. So we've looked at the Violence in the Workplace Occupational Health and Safety legislation, so the regulation in particular, the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act, we brought that up. And as well as we've gone and looked at the Farm Safety Nova Scotia Supplemental Farm Safety Plan resources. So that in a nutshell. Do you have any questions? So I'm going to stop.